This will
Yeah.
have massive impact. Yes, it's not, you wouldn't think it might be core to the company, but it is. A core part of what we do is providing drivers. And if getting drivers requires us to build our own ATS, we're going to build a freaking ATS
Yeah.
because that's what's going to move the needle for us.
Hey, and welcome to this episode of Build versus Buy, a 30-minute conversation with product and engineering leaders about situations during their career where they've had to decide whether to build or buy. If you'd like to be a guest, reach out to me at Mang-Git@useanvil.com. That's Manggit@useanvil.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a rating/review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Build vs. Buy podcast. I'm your host, Mang-Git, co-founder and CEO of Anvil. And today I have Evan Goldin. He is the co-founder and CEO of Parkade. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks. Great to be here.
To start, we always like to get to know our guests a little bit. So if you could give a little background about your work history, your personal history, whatever you would like to share, and also share a little bit about Parkade since that's the company you're working on.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I've been working in technology for a long time now, pretty much ever since college. So coming up on 20 years, about 17 years. And I'm a lifelong transportation nut. So I've been obsessed with everything transportation since I was in overalls, which of course were train conductor overalls when I was a little kid, had a season pass to like a train amusement park. Just really been obsessed with how people get places forever. And got to really dive into that full time 100% when I took a job at a company called Zimride back in 2012, which was the predecessor to Lyft. And we were the group that created Lyft and sold off Zimride pretty quickly, which was a peer-to-peer long distance ride sharing service, not
Mm-hmm.
short distance. And we got into the short distance ride sharing game in May of 2012. Think most people know the rest of the history. Competed really heavily with Uber. The growth years from 2012 to 2015 were absolutely insane and went from a product that started out as a dream and a hackathon and was put together in a couple of weeks to a brand name that's public company used around the world now and still maintains heavy market share all around the US. Been doing that and then ran product and engineering at a company called Chariot, which was an on-demand shuttle system. We had a both consumer and B2B oriented business, serving consumers here in San Francisco with rides pretty much from the outer neighborhoods of San Francisco to downtown San Francisco, and then had a B2B business where we would serve private clients like Genentech and Facebook and Google and folks like that with their essentially shuttle services around campus or to work. And that got acquired by Ford around the time I joined. Spent 2 years working at Ford/Chariot, and then eventually decided I really wanted to pursue this dream of solving parking. You can see kind of the arc of my career is really making better use of idle assets, and there's no asset that is more idle than parking. There's about 8 parking spots for every car in the U.S. There's enough land area used by parking in the United States to fill the entire state of West Virginia. The LA County devotes more land to parking than they do to housing. Just a really excessive, poorly planned resource.
Mm-hmm.
And something I was really excited about fixing. So started Parkade, we pivoted a couple times, but eventually found a really great business in becoming an end-to-end parking solution for private buildings. So apartments, offices, retirement communities, places where there are specific tenants to prioritize and make sure they have reliable, dependable, great parking. Sometimes there's money involved, sometimes there's not. And we've really become a combination of a technology platform and a service that really takes parking off the plates of whoever's managing that building. So really excited about that. The co-founder and CEO, we've been at it now for 6 years and just raised our Series A last month.
Wow, congrats. That's very recent.
Shot off the press.
Yeah, no, totally. And also it's kind of funny that you went from like mobility to like more stationary pursuits, I guess, with parking, but still related to mobility in some ways.
Very related. Yeah, you can't get a place generally without both a way to get there and a way to park your vehicle at that place. So
Yeah,
key to the mobility journey as well.
absolutely. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of these more self-driving vehicles and the dynamics within a city in terms of parking when people don't need parking. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on that at some point. Maybe we can sprinkle that into the conversation today a little bit.
Sure.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Cool. Well, to really hit on the topic of our podcast, which is Build Versus Buy, I wanted to dig into a time when you, as a founder or product manager or as whatever role you were in, had to make a decision around building versus buying. And I think you mentioned a couple of great stories and experiences that you've had, but I think you have one that you wanted to share, and maybe we can kind of dive into that thought process a little bit.
Yeah. Let's zoom back to late 2012, right? So on the first PM at Lyft, we are growing like crazy. We're preparing for our second city. Things are going really well in San Francisco. We've gone from doing a couple rides a night
Mhm.
in a closed beta to doing probably thousands, if not 10 to 20,000 rides a day in San Francisco. So things are going really well. Team is growing. I think probably around then we'd raised some cash or we're close to it. And as we grew and as we launched into new markets, it became very clear that we had product market fit. And the
Mhm.
limiting factor to us was getting a driver that was close to you, right? So we used to have these people we would call button mashers in the early days, where in the early days, people don't remember it now because it's so easy to get a driver because we solved this problem. But in the
Yeah.
early days of Lyft, especially at peak periods before we had demand-based pricing, you would open the Lyft app and you could not see a driver. They would
Mhm.
appear for a half a second and then they would disappear. And so we'd have these button mashers that would just click, 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 request ride. We would see people doing this for 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes sometimes, just sitting there waiting for a driver because honestly, doing that from the comfort of your apartment or the bar you're at was a better experience than walking outside and raising your hand for
Mhm.
a taxi. So we were very, very supply constrained as a business. And that
Mhm.
was clearly the key problem that we needed to solve.
And
So
did Lyft
our, yeah,
did Lyft ever have a model where they worked with like black car drivers or anything, or was it always kind of independent contractor drivers?
it's always been independent contractors, but even black
Okay.
card drivers were often independent contractors.
Yeah.
So we dabbled with a model where I wouldn't even say we dabbled. We explored a model where for our New York launch, we were thinking about partnering with some existing
Mhm.
cert providers that had 10, 20, 30 drivers, something like that, but didn't actually end up launching that, I believe. And if we did, those people still would have been independent contractors to us. So that was the bottleneck. The bottleneck was how do we get as many drivers on the road? Because what we found is if to make you a really happy customer, we needed to get you a driver within 3 minutes of you. And to
Mhm.
do that, we needed a lot more drivers on the road. So our challenge was as we launch these new markets, and especially you can think about it as we like go to a new market like Chicago, how do we go from having zero drivers to having 4,000, ten
Yeah.
thousand drivers? That was a huge challenge, especially because there was a lot involved in onboarding a driver, right? To get onboard a
Mhm.
driver, you have to get them excited. You have to run a background check. You have to run a DMV check. You have to inspect their vehicle. You have to, at that time, interview them and make sure they're a good contributing factor or they would contribute well as a driver, they would treat people well, they can know how to interact. Maybe we're confirming they can speak the language, all use technology a little bit, enough to use an app, all that kind of stuff. So there were a lot of steps, and all throughout that you have to keep that person excited who may be
Yeah.
looking for other work, right? They may be thinking, oh, I can be a Lyft driver, I can go take a job working the front desk at a library or something. Like you need to catch them and get them on before you lose them. So we were spending a lot of time essentially building our supply, and our supply was
Mhm.
drivers. And we even hired a huge account executive team of this was probably 50 to 100 people in 2013 who did nothing but call these drivers all day long and move them through the funnel. So as a product person, I thought as the first PM at Lyft, my job would be working on the mobile app and getting people shipping more ways for you to like request a Lyft Plus or carpool. We had the Lyft Line product we
Yeah.
launched, which is a natural extension of Lyft services, is to get in a ride with another person. But increasingly became clear that the most important thing at the company was onboarding more drivers. And so a big question started to arise of, okay, what's the most impactful thing we can do here? it's clearly doing something to
Hmm.
overhaul how we onboard drivers. And we started to debate, okay, we were using Salesforce at the time to
Hmm.
track our driver supply. And we started to debate, should we build something ourselves or do we buy something? Do we can hire a team to modify Salesforce? Salesforce is supposedly very developer friendly. Do we hire a
Hmm.
team to modify Salesforce to really suit our needs? And that was a tough decision. And we went through a lot of debate internally to figure it out. We kept asking ourselves questions and it took time to find the right answer to that.
What were some of the questions that you asked internally in making this decision? I mean, I think there obviously it sounded like onboarding new drivers is extremely important to Lyft, but also that is not what the average consumer associates with Lyft, right? Not onboard drivers, we associate push a button, get a
Right.
car, right? So how did you go about that debate with your internal team?
Yeah, two things come to mind. I mean, I think one is we really had to ask ourselves, what is Lyft and like what's core to the company?
Hmm.
Are we a software company that's got whose core part of our product is just an onboarding driver system, a system
Hmm.
to onboard people really smoothly, or are we just providing rides? And that's we're just connecting drivers and riders, and that's all we care about. What's core to us was really important, and then also what's going to move the needle is was really important. So
Hmm.
we did some looking around. We talked to some other companies. I specifically remember going to visit a company called Cherry at the time,
Hmm.
which was doing on-demand car washing, and sitting down with their then CEO Travis Vanderzin, and learning
Not
what
the
their
other
approach
Travis.
was. Not bad Travis. No,
Yeah.
no, this is good Travis. And we sat with him, really learned how Cherry was scaling, and they had the opposite problem that we did. They
Hmm.
were scaling really, really smoothly and had a lot of people moving through their onboarding funnel as drivers, not drivers, car washers, really smoothly, but they were struggling to hit product market fit and struggling to make the economics work.
Hmm.
So they had solved some problems that we hadn't, and they showed us their homemade custom built onboarding ATS, and it was really, really smooth. They had all these steps that were really, really hard on our side, right? Something like running a DMV check. In
Hmm.
Salesforce, you're not going to, maybe you can today, but 10 years ago, you certainly couldn't kick off a DMV check the moment someone submits their information. So that could potentially cause a 3-day delay, right? Say I
Yeah.
call you on a Friday at 2 p.m. and I say, hey, I really need your DMV information to get this process moving. Can you send it to me? Cool, you send it to me at 7 p.m. I'm not going to see that email until maybe 8 a.m. on Monday. We're
Hmm.
talking days of delay getting people through the funnel. So they were able to do things like, hey, the moment someone submits this form, kick off their DMV check. And that was really impactful to the onboarding funnel for them. So we eventually actually, I think, Aqua hired Cherry, bought Cherry and for parts and bought it for Travis and Steve and some of the folks over there. Didn't exactly bring in the technology, but we really used their guidance. And Travis was definitely the person who's like, you need to rebuild this. Like this will
Yeah.
have massive impact. Yes, it's not you wouldn't think it might be core to the company, but it is. A core part of what we do is providing drivers. And if getting drivers requires us to build our own ATS, we're going to build a freaking ATS
Yeah.
because that's what's going to move the needle for us. So those are really like the two things that we looked at.
It's
Obviously,
interesting because
scope,
like
of course, as well. Like the scope of the project was important.
right. I was gonna say it's interesting because like in a lot of ways, the product that Lyft is providing isn't necessarily just a car ride. It's providing equilibrium in a service that's demanded in a service that's requested, right? And so you had the big problem of not being able to provide that equilibrium with this kind of like slow, clunky onboarding
Right.
flow. And so that in some ways means okay, maybe this slow and clunky flow should be your core product. Another way to think about it could be that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that like your drivers are also your customers. You need to keep them excited. And the longer
Absolutely.
it takes them to move through the funnel to actually become a driver, the more likely they're going to drop off and not buy the product, which is ability to make money on the Lyft platform, which is your product, right? So I think it's like a little bit of definition of what the company provides and what who the company serves. Sounds like was a lot of the conversation that you had internally and with the Cherry team.
Yeah, 100%. And so that's the path we went down.
Nice. Okay, so let's tell us a little bit more. What did you do once the Cherry team came in? What was the exact path that you guys went down?
Yeah, so we ended up, especially with Travis's guidance, building out an internal ATS. And we, from scratch, built software that moved people through the onboarding funnel, custom built for us, right? With all
Hmm.
these things and triggers that could happen automatically. Like the moment someone does X, kick off their background check. The moment they do this, send them this. We could send people a custom list of like, what steps have you not completed? Please do those things now. And we actually end up doing some pretty interesting things, like we spun out the what we call the driver inspection to our
Hmm.
drivers. So it used to be in the early days, like it made more sense for this to be in Salesforce because we were doing this stuff in our office, right? We were interviewing like 50 drivers a day, and then an account executive was like filling things out at their desk after the interview or maybe in the
Hmm.
interview. Once we launched this, we were actually able to launch our mentor product, which
Hmm.
allowed us to actually leverage our own driver base as the interviewers, which was super cool,
Hmm.
right? So like it used to be the case that our own staff would do this, and you could never have. I don't think there's a good way for like your driver base to be using your Salesforce instance and
Yeah.
updating your Salesforce data. But by doing this, we were able to say, okay, we're going to offload interviewing Evan to a driver. And that way, like the moment Evan needs an inspection, a vehicle inspection interview, cool, he clicks a button in the mobile app he already has because it's in the Lyft app,
Hmm.
and he can schedule that inspection right in the app. All of that data gets updated into our system automatically. So we ended up spending probably almost 6 months just building the V1 of this.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was of the ATS. Mentoring came later. And then this became a really core product to Lyft. And this was what I spent probably the majority of my last or middle year at Lyft working on, was just improving this, finding all the ways to really move the needle. We were able to bring, if I recall, the average time from first application to the driver doing their first ride from 21 days to I think under 7. And we were able to make it possible for people to actually go from applying to being on the road within 3 days. So we were able to really speed up the onboarding flow, which really transformed how quickly we could get drivers, which transformed the underlying business.
Yeah, got it. And so in a lot of ways, you by owning that experience, you created the ability to scale. That Lyft was already running against scale issues, but if you were using Salesforce and trying to hook all these things together, you would not have the ability to offload, like you said, the mentor program, right? To have other drivers interview drivers. So in a lot of ways, you did actually have to bring in more control of that entire process so that you could do these things that help you have a competitive advantage in recruiting new drivers and onboarding new drivers and getting the supply up to match the demand. I can imagine by the end, not by the end, but like by like the time that Lyft and Uber had become household names, each time you launched a new city, it was probably like instant demand, but like you really had to like ratchet up the supply of drivers really quickly in order to meet that instant demand because people already knew about Lyft. They already had taken Lyfts elsewhere. We didn't have this issue that you might have had at the beginning, which is like a new product nobody really knows. You're still trying to like find your footing. Yeah.
Yeah, we were constantly balancing supply and demand, and we did go from a place where, in the early days of launching cities, we'd have like 50 drivers, and then
Hmm.
in later days we'd have like 500 drivers, and then that actually turned out to be too many. So then we would work on programs to spur additional demand. So it was a constant balancing act, but our like you said, our core need was to balance supply and demand, and so we had to do whatever we could do to make that happen, even if it meant building our own applicant tracking system.
Interesting. Do you know? I guess like it sounded like it became a pretty core part of Lyft. Is to this day, is it still something that is like being maintained and worked on internally at Lyft, or is
Yeah. Yeah, to
yeah?
my knowledge. I mean, obviously, boarding drivers is still there. There's a lot of drivers are doing Lyft temporarily. So that
Hmm.
was always a big challenge, was like, even if you onboard 1,000 people, 6 months later, 200 people might still be driving,
Yeah.
even if they're having a great experience. So yeah, I think I can guarantee there's some form of ATS there still. I
Hmm.
do think they worked eventually on a next generation of it. So it might have, in my day, it was called mission control. Or actually, I think in the early days it was called ATS. And then I think they built a next gen version called Mission Control, and I don't know what it's called these days. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's still around.
Got it. I mean, I think this is really fascinating because for the listeners who listened to our metronome episode with my buddy Scott, who worked at Dropbox with me, he actually built an ATS system for Dropbox in doing hiring. I think in the end, you know, spoiler alert for those who haven't listened to that episode, they actually sunset the product internally. The hypothesis at the time was to build such a good recruiting experience that Dropbox could recruit the best and most talented individuals to work there. Obviously, long term, that seemed to not really make sense for a company like Dropbox because I think a lot of things that we discussed today on this podcast, which is, you know, it wasn't whatever scale that Dropbox was hiring at, it was nowhere near the scale that Lyft was hiring at. And also Lyft had special requirements in their mass hiring process that a standard employer might, like a W-2 employer, might not have, like the DMV checks and setting up all of the other kind of infrastructure stuff that you need in order to get somebody onboarded into the Lyft product. Do you think that like the scale was really one of the driving factors in building this internally?
I mean, yeah, yes, definitely, but scale is relative, and I would think it'd more be a question of, is that really core to their business? Like, is
Hmm.
that a core part of Dropbox's business? No, I wouldn't think it is. And I think that's a commodity, right? Like every other, they're no different, I would think, in how they need to hire, or they're not significantly different in how they need to hire than just about any other company out there. So why couldn't they use any number of the available ATS options on the market? So I think it's a good example. I mean, Lyft on our side, another thing we built that is maybe a questionable example of build versus buy is we ended up building what we call the Lyft family tree, which still exists today, which is a way for people to track people at the company. And it would just say like what team you're on, when did you join Lyft, and then it had some Lyft specific data like how many rides has this person taken. I don't know the privacy implications these days, but like in the beginning, it would say like, "What's your most common destination?" to other employees and stuff. There were I know some discussions about like, should we really be sharing this with other employees? But like, we were
Yeah.
trying to provide people fun information. It would tell people your birthday and who you reported to, and some other stuff like that. And on that, I think that's much more of a questionable like, did we really need to build that? That's not core to the
Hmm.
company. And I think I don't want to say it was a mistake to build that. I think we got something out of it, but I think there's also probably other software in the market that we could have used to replicate that. And I think it was
Yeah.
more just done just because people were interested in it and had some free time, but it's not something that was like encouraged to be built by
Yeah.
any leadership of the company.
It sounds like one of those hackathon projects and
It
maybe
was. It started as a
contributed to
hackathon. Yeah, yeah,
makes sense. I would say maybe it contributed to culture, but definitely the privacy
totally.
implications of like, why is Joe going to Sarah's house the most frequently? Like that's probably stuff you don't want posted on your internal
Yeah.
internal directory.
Well, and I don't know. I mean, I left like as this was getting rolled out, so
Yeah.
I'm sure and I know they got some like privacy feedback and probably changed the final version quite a bit. But it was a fun product, and like I missed having it, and like enjoyed the ability to like there was a time actually, which I don't think is actually that questionable, where you could see where your coworker was in the office. It
Oh.
would like use Wi-Fi triangulation and be like, oh, Evan is in this conference room. And that was actually really useful because like if I was the office was decently big, it was like 60,000 square feet, and it was helpful to be able to like find my boss sometimes.
Yeah.
And was that a secret? Like it wasn't gonna it didn't show where you were outside of the office. It just said like,
Right.
if you're in the office, you're here. So anyway, there was some like cool functionality we had in it that was helpful, but it was absolutely non-core and not something I necessarily like would advocate for anyone to build on their own, it seems like a classic buy.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like there's a lot of like directory management systems out there today that do a lot of this
Yeah.
functionality. Curious, one thought around Lyft. I know in more recent years, Lyft has expanded beyond car rides. I think most notably bike share programs and kind of just becoming a mobility company in general. How would you think about that as a, I guess like it was, how do you think about that as like, hey, is this a core part of Lyft's company mission, product, what you guys are delivering, or should that have been something that they maybe left to another company to build?
Oh, tough question. I mean, I'm probably like one of the top bike share power users
Mm.
of Lyft still to this day in San Francisco. I know I've taken more than 3,000 miles worth of rides on their bay wheel system, and I love it and swear by it. I even unfortunately smashed my head into a curb on a bay wheels a couple months ago. So wear a helmet and don't text
Yeah.
and bike. But big fan, and I think Lyft struggles overall have been reflective of their difficulty figuring out what exactly their mission is, right? Like we decided early on, like our mission is really going to focus on rides and not all goods. And that was good for a while until COVID hit. And Uber was very
Mhm.
well diversified and was able to focus on deliveries and other things that Lyft was not well positioned for. Lyft for a while was trying to be more than just a ride. It was trying to be your transportation app. And you could see public transportation, you could book public transportation in the app and do other things like that. So I think they've struggled a bit to really figure out their identity, and I think they're still struggling with that to this day. Not that that's an easy problem by any means.
Yeah, no, I will say as a avid user of Lyft and specifically bike share programs in New York City, I always travel with a helmet when I go to New York. It's pretty convenient having everything in just one app. I mean, I know no matter which, well, pretty much the cities I visit, I can pull open the Lyft app and it will let me rent a bicycle to get around town without having to download yet another app or download Lime or something to use a scooter. So that's been pretty
Oh, it's
nice.
amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love. I yeah. I like I said, I've taken thousands of bike share rides, and I think especially with their e-bike, it is the best way to get around town. It is unbelievable, and my commute to work. I have a 2 mile commute. I'm door to door in about 13 minutes, which was today. I was a rare day. I drove today and sat in. We have traffic again here in San Francisco, thankfully in some ways,
Yeah.
and took me about 35-40 minutes to get to work, and it's probably gonna be similar getting home because there's a big conference in town. And bay wheels, you just see all, you get to fly by all that traffic, zero emissions. It's usually pretty safe if you pay attention to where you're going, but yeah, it's a great service, but I think they've also struggled with the unit economics of that.
Yeah.
Right, cities, it varies, but cities generally don't subsidize bike share in the way that they subsidize public transit or even private driving with building and maintaining roads. So it's tough to compete with that, and that's made that a business I know Lyft has talked about shelving a few times.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for I wouldn't say for better for worse. I would say for worse. I think the governments and especially municipalities still prioritize driving and parking, I guess, in a way to move people around their cities and their states. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
not
you're in New York. You see that in the battle of congestion pricing of just charging $9 to drive into the busiest, densest part of North America. And suddenly drivers are faced with the prospect of actually covering the costs of their own driving. And there's been public freakouts all over the place, and political freakouts, and even Donald Trump threatening to get involved. So I think we absolutely face that. And I hope that offering things like City Bike, Lyft has helped open people's eyes to, hey, there's actually a better way to get around these cities.
Mhm.
If only we can continue to make these places safer and not have crappy bike infrastructure that people hit and fall off their bikes onto. So I'm glad Lyft got into that game. I think they are the best maker of bike share systems in the world by a wide margin.
Mhm.
And I hope that that's a really, economically great business to get in, because I hope they don't give up on it, and I hope others get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly enjoy riding all those bikes when I'm traveling around. I do want to bring it. back to the ATS system a little bit to wrap this up. You mentioned that as far as you can tell, that the ATS system is still in operation, or I guess it's not called the ATS system anymore, but what did you call it? Like mission control, I think it was. Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah. What, maybe mission control. Yeah.
Yeah. But it sounds like there has been another life for this product, even outside of Lyft. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, not this product exactly, but
Yeah.
when we were looking at building an ATS,
Hmm.
there was nothing good out there. And these days, essentially what we built turned into, it wasn't us, but it turned into another startup called Fountain. So
Hmm.
Fountain went out and created an ATS built for companies that are kind of, I think, focused on the on-demand workforce.
Hmm.
And had that been around at the time, would have changed the conversation, because part of your conversation in build versus buy should be what are the buy options? Because in our day, the buy options were terrible. And if your buy options are great, that totally can change the equation, right? When we went to, a good example is that is at Lyft, when we went to figure out how do we actually implement billing credit cards for these rides and debit cards, do we do
Hmm.
that ourselves or do we use Stripe? Even in its early days, with Stripe was pretty rough. The APIs were pretty rough. The docs were pretty rough at the time. We went with Stripe because that was a significantly better option than what we thought we could do on our own. So it's if Fountain, I think, turned into I think they're doing well. I have no idea, but
Yeah.
it certainly turned out that there was a viable business just building what we built for ourselves and building it for lots of other companies.
Yeah, I think the dynamics of hiring massive amounts of people for like for Lyft or for warehouses or for delivery certainly has different types of problems that the standard ATS applicant tracking systems for hiring, let's call it white collar workers, just doesn't really address. We at Anvil, we have customers that use Anvil to do a lot of onboarding of migrant farm workers. Farms need to hire 4,000 fruit pickers over the course of a weekend because that fruit needs to be picked now. They build custom flows specifically for this use case and then are expanding from there. And we see it as they built a lot of the paperwork aspects around it on Anvil, but we get to see kind of like the complexities of that really you're kind of hard pressed sometimes to find I mean, for migrant farm hiring, I guess, like, there's not really a solution out there when they started, and so it's definitely more of a internal build and figure out what parts of it you can outsource a little bit more to be by. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Evan, this has been fascinating. Really enjoyed talking about Lyft, talking about your work history. We do always like to end our episodes with some kind of like fun questions at the very end. So maybe to start, let us know something that you've been working on, whether it's personal or professional, that you're really excited about. I know it's the beginning of the year, so you're excited about charging ahead in 2025.
Yeah, we just raised Series A at Parkade. I'm pumped to be working on that and figuring out how to go from managing parking in hundreds of buildings to thousands and then tens of thousands. So that's going to be my focus for probably a very long time. And really excited to be doing that. So if anyone's interested in making better use of parking and really helping people make better use of idle parking or underpriced parking, let us know. We have a jobs page. It's Parkade, but that'll be certainly what I'm working on for a long time to come.
Awesome. Congrats on the Series A. Are we the first place you've announced this? I didn't do a Google search or anything ahead of time.
We're not like pushing the news out super hard, but
Yeah.
I think it's public info anyway. So feel free to
Love
shout
it.
it wherever.
Breaking news on the Build versus Buy podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. And then the last thing we always like to ask is share a product that you maybe purchased recently that you either love or would never buy again. So we typically have people share stuff that they've loved, but yeah, let us know what it is.
Yeah, I finally, after many years, changed my iPhone case. I'd had different iPhone cases, but always from the same company. And I finally got a new one from a company called Peak Design, which is recently very famous thanks
Yeah.
to the guy that assassinated the CEO of United Healthcare, who was wearing a Peak Design backpack. I bought the Peak Design iPhone case, and it's been really, really nice. It like is was very thoughtfully designed in a way where you can snap it into all these different devices with ease. It works really nicely. It survived my bike crash and kept my phone well protected, so it can certainly vouch for its durability. But just been a big fan of that, and it's helped me use my phone as a camera, which is nice. So that's what's recording me right now. I just like pop it in very easily with a big design case, take it right out, and I've just become a big fan. So.
That's awesome. I think I always like to share something that I purchased as well on this podcast. And I was thinking about it because I'm running out of things to share. And I've definitely seen the Peak Design like backpacks and phone because they're very popular here in San Francisco. I think for a while as part of the standard uniform. But speaking of standard uniform of tech workers, I guess the thing that I really love recently, or not so recently, but somewhat recently, is American Giant. I'm not sure if anybody knows or whoever's listening has heard of American Giant. They are a clothing brand and they source and make all of their clothing in the United States, including the cotton that is grown. And I first heard of them about, I want to say 11 years ago when the company I was working at, Dialpad, they actually bought a bunch of American Giant hoodies for everybody. And it was, I think, New York Times or some news publication said it was the best hoodie ever made. And this is definitely back in those Zuckerberg days where everybody's wearing hoodies to work. So if you're looking for some good quality shirts, American Giant, I'm wearing American Giant right now. These t-shirts I've had for like a year. They go through the ringer and they last. I think that's the big thing. They last. I've had so many shirts that just shrink, fray, get thin. I've had these for over a year and a half, multiple washes. I wear them every day. So that's my pitch for a new product to
Nice.
go purchase.
Good pitch. Good pitch.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Evan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really enjoyed talking about Lyft, about the ATS system. I think it's a great kind of like contrast to my previous episode where we kind of go through the nuances as to why it does actually make sense to build an ATS sometimes versus buy. And hopefully it gives our listeners some insights into how they can think about their own build versus buy journey. Thanks for being on the
Great.
show.
Yeah. I appreciate the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you found this show valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or here on YouTube. We'd love if you could leave us a rating and/or a review, as that helps others find this podcast. See you next time.